a nondescript suitcase, a Soviet spy in custody, and a locked evidence room where agents held their breath. When the FBI cracked it open, they didn't just find spy gear or stolen documents, they uncovered a silent war playing out in America's capital, and it was already much closer than anyone feared. Washington, 1963. The Cold War was invisible, but everywhere, woven into quiet neighborhoods, office buildings, and even the nation's train stations. When federal agents closed in on a man calling himself Peter Karlov at Union Station, they didn't just find a suspected Soviet operative. They found a suitcase, ordinary, worn, the kind of thing a salesman might carry. But what was inside wasn't clothing or travel papers. It was the blueprint to something far more dangerous. A secret so explosive, it triggered a manhunt across the entire eastern seaboard. This is the story of how one suitcase cracked open a Soviet spy ring and nearly brought the U.S. intelligence community to its knees. He stepped off the train at Union Station just past noon, a man in his early 40s with a stiff gait and a face that seemed deliberately average, neither forgettable nor distinct. He moved like someone who had rehearsed the act of being inconspicuous, whose very existence was engineered to dissolve into crowds. The name on his passport was Peter Karlov, a supposed Canadian businessman visiting Washington for trade consultations, but the FBI already knew that no such man existed. Not really. The identity traced back to a child who had died in Ontario in 1937, a name resurrected decades later by Soviet intelligence. The agents tailing him had been watching for weeks, tracking movements through diner receipts, coded personal ads in the classifieds, and hollowed out dead drops under public benches. But the final decision to arrest him didn't come from surveillance photos or intercepted radio bursts. It came from the object in his hand, a scuffed leather suitcase. The bag had appeared with him at every meeting, every hotel lobby linger, every morning train platform, never opened, never checked. When the FBI obtained a blurry surveillance image showing a false seam stitched into the bottom lining, it became more than suspicious. It became actionable. That afternoon, as he approached the station's exit, agents closed in, flanking from either side like bookends snapping shut. "Sir, we need a moment of your time." The man didn't run. He simply blinked, adjusted his glasses, and offered a calm, rehearsed smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I am not understanding," he said, in clean but careful English. "Is there some mistake?" The lead agent held up his badge, already signaling to the others to secure the bag. "Let's talk inside." The suitcase was passed gently into a plastic evidence container, zipped, and escorted out the side entrance under armed watch. Karlov, or whatever his real name was, remained silent as he was led into the field office just blocks away, surrounded by men whose expressions didn't flinch. As the interrogation room door clicked shut behind him, the agents in the adjacent evidence lab opened the suitcase, expecting perhaps cash, fake documents, or a few disassembled pieces of surveillance equipment. What they found instead was stranger and far more dangerous. Tucked beneath a neatly folded overcoat was a series of sealed microfilm canisters labeled in Cyrillic script. Under a false bottom, a compartment held miniature optics, a coded ledger, and a handwritten note marked with what appeared to be Ministry of State Security identifiers. A smaller envelope contained high-resolution images of U.S. military schematics, some still bearing confidential stamps from bases in Nevada and Virginia. At that moment, the room grew quiet. One of the analysts stood frozen, eyes wide, as he realized that these weren't just files, they were active operational blueprints. The suitcase wasn't a message, it was a confession, packed in leather and left in plain sight. By the time the agents turned their attention back to the man in the interrogation room, they knew the truth. They hadn't just arrested a spy, they had cracked open the front door to a hidden war already being fought in their own backyard. The suitcase itself was nothing remarkable at first glance. Dented at the corners, its leather worn to a soft sheen that hinted at decades of travel, with a brass latch that stuck just slightly when twisted to the right. The handle was darkened with the oil of 100 hands, and a faded airline sticker still clung stubbornly to the side. Montreal to Washington, economy class. It was the kind of bag a traveling salesman might carry, or perhaps an aging academic hauling lecture notes, but certainly not something that screamed espionage. Yet when the agents placed it under the lights of the secure evidence room, something about its weight didn't match its appearance. It was heavy, too heavy for its size, and when they ran it through the standard X-ray scanner, they didn't like what they saw. The interior had irregular density zones, suspicious dead spaces, and what appeared to be a layer of thin metallic mesh embedded beneath the leather surface. They began the examination slowly, carefully cutting through the inner lining, first peeling back the silk interior to reveal a false bottom, stitched in with monofilament thread so fine it barely registered even under magnification. The compartment beneath it wasn't just a hollow cavity, it was a reinforced cell, lined with a fine metallic foil that looked like a cross between copper shielding and radiation insulation, suggesting that whatever had been stored inside needed to be protected, not just from damage, but from detection. One of the senior analysts, a former NSA materials specialist, remarked that the shielding resembled the kind used to block electromagnetic fields, a common Cold War countermeasure designed to keep sensitive electronic contents from being scanned remotely. That's when they found the first anomaly, a hidden seam along the rear wall of the compartment that, when pressed with just the right amount of pressure, clicked open like a spring-loaded vault. Inside was a compartment no larger than a deck of cards, and within it, a pair of microdot readers, the kind used to decode compressed photographic data embedded in ordinary text or even punctuation marks. Elsewhere in the suitcase, they discovered neatly folded civilian clothes, an American paperback novel hollowed out at the center to house a tightly wound film reel, and a pack of European cigarettes whose foil lining had been carefully unwrapped and then resealed. Inside were thin, transparent sheets containing miniature blueprints. Tucked into the side pouch was a glasses case, but the lenses inside were not prescription. They were specialized polarized optics, the type used to read invisible ink or embedded markings in altered documents. Every item in the suitcase seemed to serve two purposes: camouflage and function, normality hiding high-grade espionage tools. By the time the team finished their initial sweep, they had documented no fewer than 7 concealed compartments, each more ingenious than the last. And though they had yet to catalog the contents of every microfilm canister or decrypt the handwritten ciphers tucked into a false passport sleeve, one thing was already clear: this suitcase had never belonged to a businessman. It was a mobile archive of Soviet intelligence, and it had just fallen into American hands. The agents gathered around the examination table in a room chilled to preserve evidence integrity, gloved hands moving with clinical precision as they began cataloging what lay inside the compartments of the Soviet courier's suitcase, each new discovery tightening the grip of disbelief around the room. From one panel slid out a felt-lined tray housing microfilm canisters, not 2 or 3, but dozens, packed tightly in rows like ammunition in a weapons crate. They bore handwritten labels in a mix of Cyrillic shorthand and coded symbols, some dated as far back as 1959, others as recent as the month before the arrest. A few canisters had clearly been handled more than others, their caps worn smooth from repeated use. As one of the technicians loaded the first strip into the projector, the room darkened, and the fluorescent flicker of grainy images appeared on the screen: satellite trajectory diagrams, electrical schematics, and what appeared to be surveillance blueprints for military facilities, their layouts meticulously labeled in English with top secret stamps partially visible in the corners. The document headers bore the unmistakable insignia of the U.S. Department of Defense, and the implication hit like a jolt. These weren't historical archives, they were active blueprints, still in use across bases in Virginia, California, and New Mexico. Another canister revealed high-altitude aerial reconnaissance photos, likely taken from U-2 flights or stolen from internal Pentagon analysis, showing test ranges, radar installations, and equipment arrays at what appeared to be an airfield deep in Nevada desert. Then came the cameras, 2 of them, no larger than cigarette packs, one embedded inside what looked like a standard lighter, and the other disguised as a vintage pocket watch, each fitted with film no thicker than a fingernail. When dismantled, the watch camera revealed a lens capable of capturing entire documents from inches away, and the backplate had been carefully etched with a tiny serial code that would later match Soviet intelligence equipment cataloged during East German defections. Buried beneath a pair of socks was a thick envelope wrapped in twine and sealed with a red wax stamp. Inside was a single page of thin, onion skin paper folded multiple times, the Russian cursive faint but legible under magnification. The translation would later confirm it as a field instruction memo, likely written by a handler. Its message was concise but chilling. Proceed with final transfer. Agent's window closes by 14th. If compromised, destroy reel 7. Prioritize Sierra target route. Next to the envelope was a fake East German passport bearing the name Kurt Weiss, complete with visa stamps, a perfectly forged work permit, and even a subtle scent of tobacco embedded in the leather, an olfactory detail added to imply age and authenticity. Most damning of all, nestled beneath the false bottom of a shaving kit, were 3D, neatly bundled stacks of American $100 bills, each stamped with serial numbers traceable to a Midwest bank recently flagged for counterfeit laundering. The contents of the suitcase were no longer evidence. They were a declaration. Soviet intelligence had penetrated deep, and someone on the inside had been feeding them sensitive, possibly ongoing U.S. defense secrets for years. By the time the full contents of the suitcase had been logged, and the first wave of microfilm images developed under tight chain of custody protocols, Washington was already beginning to shake beneath the quiet weight of panic. The kind of panic that doesn't flash in headlines, but ripples in urgent whispers behind closed doors. The photographs, blueprints, and internal memoranda bearing the seals of the Department of Defense, combined with the presence of microdot readers and high-level access credentials, forced the FBI to declare a national counterintelligence emergency, Code Red. The designation hadn't been used in nearly a decade, and its invocation triggered an immediate response. Emergency security briefings with top brass at the Pentagon, unscheduled midnight calls to NASA headquarters, and a classified alert dispatch to every U.S. military installation on the eastern seaboard. The threat wasn't just theoretical, it was already breathing down the necks of programs considered untouchable. Project Sierra, one of the code names mentioned in the Russian note, was tied to experimental satellite defense arrays, technology not even formally acknowledged as to exist. And suddenly, someone in Moscow had enough detail to blueprint its circuitry. By morning, the White House Situation Room was humming under fluorescent light, a rotating cast of intelligence directors, military advisors, and senior staffers seated around polished oak, parsing the implications with furrowed brows and clipped tones. The president had not yet been briefed in full, but he had already been warned that the breach might implicate contractors tied to the Strategic Defense Initiative. Meanwhile, the FBI began a quiet internal war, an aggressive audit of every individual with access to the classified documents recovered in the suitcase. The list was long, too long. It reached across departments, agencies, defense contractors, and even into private research institutions. Clearance logs were pulled, background checks reopened, financial records swept for anomalies, and travel patterns cross-referenced with known Soviet contact zones. The effort was spearheaded by a newly assembled task force within the Bureau, its offices sealed off on the 8th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building, operating under the codename Deep Current. Simultaneously, the CIA initiated a shadow audit of its own networks, terrified that parallel leaks had occurred through separate channels. NASA quietly shut down 2 internal projects pending reevaluation, and at the Air Force's behest, access to several critical aerospace databanks was suspended indefinitely. Even the State Department, though peripheral to most defense operations, was forced to freeze a half-dozen diplomatic postings overseas after discovering that one of the memo templates in the suitcase matched an internal format still in circulation. Yet all of this happened behind the veil. No press conferences, no admissions, just a sudden tightening of security protocols, locked offices, and senior staff moving through corridors with drawn faces and clipped conversations. What haunted everyone the most wasn't what had already been seen, it was what hadn't. There were still 8 unopened canisters, each potentially harboring more stolen secrets, more compromised systems. Somewhere, a mole had made those copies, passed them off like discarded trash, and walked back into a U.S. facility with the badge of a patriot. The question now was, who? And how much longer could they remain hidden? In the sterile glare of the FBI's interrogation suite, the man known as Peter Karlov sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as hours ticked by with little more than the soft hum of fluorescent lighting to accompany the tension thickening between him and the agents across the table. Every question was met with silence or deliberately vague answers, his accent carefully neutralized, his demeanor unnervingly calm. He asked for legal representation, but only once, and never insisted when it was denied under the national security exception being invoked. When pressed about his travel history, his identity, or the contents of the suitcase, he merely smiled, or said nothing at all. He declined food, drank only water, slept with his back against the cell wall, and his eyes half open. But while the man remained uncooperative, the evidence in his wake began to talk. The first break came through fingerprint analysis. His prints, lifted from the suitcase handle and compared through Interpol's secure database, yielded a match, not to any known Canadian citizen, but to an intelligence file flagged decades earlier by British SIS and West German BND. The man's real name was Alexei Voronov, a Soviet national born in Leningrad, who had disappeared from official Soviet records in 1956 following his induction into the GRU, Russia's brutal and elite military intelligence service. Voronov was believed to have operated under at least 5 aliases in the preceding 20 years, with suspected fieldwork in East Berlin during the construction of the wall, and later in Saigon during the height of the Vietnam War, where several U.S. personnel died under circumstances that would later be reviewed with his presence in mind. He had been listed as probable but unconfirmed in a joint East-West Berlin counter-espionage probe in 1962, suspected of organizing black market exchanges of Western technology for Soviet infiltration tools. In 1969, a CIA case officer in Havana reported shadowing a man matching Voronov's physical description outside the Soviet embassy, just days before a listening post embedded in the U.S. diplomatic compound mysteriously ceased transmission. But in each of these cases, Voronov had vanished before confirmation, operating with surgical precision and protected by tradecraft so disciplined that many in the intelligence community had begun to suspect he was a ghost, a myth wrapped in classified rumors. Now, suddenly, he wasn't just real, he was in custody, caught red-handed on American soil with enough state secrets to fuel a decade of damage. But Voronov, for all the revelations surrounding his identity, remained maddeningly silent, refusing to even acknowledge the name Alexei. When presented with photos from East Berlin, he showed no recognition. When confronted with translated portions of the Russian field note, he blinked slowly and said only, "You misunderstand your own handwriting." Every behavioral specialist brought in to evaluate him left with the same conclusion. He was not just trained, he was hardened, built for resistance, mentally fortified against coercion. His silence wasn't defiance, it was design. Meanwhile, in Langley and the Hoover Building alike, analysts began compiling every known mission, every anomaly, every internal betrayal that might now be traced back to Voronov's hand, each red thread weaving through a growing map of Cold War treachery. They had his face, they had his prints, but what they didn't yet have was his plan. The deeper the FBI dug into the contents of the suitcase, the more it became clear that Alexei Voronov hadn't acted alone. In fact, he was merely the tip of a well-buried iceberg, the visible remnant of a broader and disturbingly efficient Soviet espionage network operating with surgical precision inside American institutions. As the microfilm was decrypted and cross-referenced against known documents, inconsistencies emerged. Some memoranda were traced not to the Department of Defense directly, but to internal drafts never intended to leave the offices of subcontractors, suggesting that the source of the leak wasn't just high-level clearance, but embedded personnel with physical access to pre-release material. The first lead came from a watermark, barely visible, on a satellite system schematic, revealing its origin as a document printed by Armitage Systems Group, a private defense contractor based in Virginia, with multiple ongoing classified contracts. A quiet investigation into Armitage's personnel uncovered a red flag in the records of one Marcus Lindell, a senior systems engineer whose recent gambling debts had been mysteriously resolved and whose secure access logs showed irregular late-night document retrievals. Surveillance was initiated. Within days, agents caught Lindell photographing classified materials using a concealed wristwatch camera remarkably similar to the model found in Voronov's suitcase. He was arrested before dawn in a sting operation that ended with his confession. He had been approached 3 years earlier by an academic from Prague with offers of collaboration that quickly turned into tradecraft. From Lindell, the thread unraveled further. One of his drops had been routinely collected by a translator at the State Department, a woman named Helen Trask, whose personnel file had shown nothing remarkable, until her travel history revealed frequent, unexplained weekend trips to meet an alleged cousin in New York. A raid on her apartment uncovered a locked box of encrypted correspondence, including payment records routed through an East German bank. She cracked under pressure, admitting to passing internal diplomatic briefings and foreign attaché schedules, documents that now matched a set of redacted summaries from the microfilm cache. The most shocking revelation came last. A code word in one of the translated Russian memos, Regal, had appeared in an internal Army intelligence report 2 years prior, authored by a retired officer who still maintained a Pentagon clearance as a private consultant. His name was Colonel Emery K. Slater, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a spotless record, a patriotic figure often featured in televised defense panels. But a closer look at Slater's offshore financial activity painted a damning portrait. A quiet search warrant executed on his Annapolis home uncovered a hidden drawer of Soviet memorabilia, multiple unregistered radio receivers, and a typewriter, whose font matched that used in a number of documents recovered from the suitcase. When confronted, Slater didn't deny his role. Instead, he demanded to speak with a Soviet diplomat, triggering alarm bells throughout the intelligence community. The realization that a high-ranking U.S. military officer had been feeding Soviet handlers data for years sent shockwaves through Washington. What began with a single man at Union Station was now exposing a rot embedded in America's most trusted institutions, and the net had only just begun to tighten. It began, as so many national ruptures do, with a leak, not from an official press briefing, but from a disgruntled junior analyst who, after overhearing 2 senior agents whispering in the corridor of the Hoover building, tipped off a friend working for a major national newspaper. Within 48 hours, the first article appeared, heavily redacted, citing anonymous government sources, and peppered with qualifiers like allegedly and reportedly, but the heart of it was unmistakable. A Soviet spy had been captured at Union Station, carrying a suitcase full of stolen American defense secrets. The article ran under the headline, "Russian Spy Infiltrates Defense Network. FBI Confirms Arrest." Almost instantly, the public reaction detonated into full-blown paranoia. Radio stations ran breathless commentary, television anchors adopted tones of grave concern, and late-night comedians delivered monologues laced with references to leather suitcases and betrayal. The New York Herald followed the story with an even more sensational headline the next morning. "Suitcase full of secrets. Cold War just got hotter." While the FBI and CIA scrambled to contain the hemorrhaging narrative, hastily issuing non-committal statements about ongoing investigations and matters of national security, the public's imagination ran wild. Editorials speculated about sleeper agents in government offices, neighbors who might be spies, and how many secrets had already slipped through the cracks. Grocery store aisles filled with whispers. Defense contractors fielded panicked calls from clients. Capitol Hill, usually a haven of political gamesmanship, was stunned into a rare moment of bipartisan urgency, with both parties demanding emergency hearings. Members of Congress scheduled classified briefings, many of them emerging from closed-door meetings, looking pale and tight-lipped. By the end of the week, even the president was forced to address the issue indirectly during a press conference, calling the incident deeply troubling and affirming the administration's unwavering commitment to rooting out threats to our national security, foreign or domestic. While the FBI had intended to quietly dismantle the spy network piece by piece, the media exposure forced their hand. Arrests that were meant to occur over the course of several weeks were expedited, executed in a flurry of pre-dawn raids that played out on live television in several cities. Footage of Marcus Lindell being escorted from his suburban home in handcuffs aired between segments on daytime talk shows. Helen Trask's mugshot appeared in magazines alongside headlines questioning how a woman with access to international diplomatic memos could so easily go unnoticed. But it was the revelation of Colonel Emery K. Slater's arrest that hit hardest. A decorated war veteran, familiar to many Americans from Sunday political roundtables, Slater's connection to the Soviet ring was a betrayal that felt almost cinematic in scope. His face on the front page of Time under the word traitor sent a cultural tremor through the nation's military psyche. The narrative that followed was no longer just about espionage. It became a crisis of trust, a nationwide reckoning with the idea that America's most dangerous enemies might not be abroad, but embedded within the very institutions built to protect it. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, Alexei Voronov sat quietly, watching the fire he had lit spread with perfect silent precision. Capitol Hill transformed overnight from a form of legislative routine to a stage of national reckoning as the political establishment scrambled to respond to the revelation that a Soviet spy ring had operated under the noses of the American defense and intelligence apparatus. Within days of the story breaking, the Senate convened emergency hearings under the Committee on Governmental Affairs, hastily rebranded by the press as the Spy Suitcase Sessions. Senators, some of whom had long warned about Soviet infiltration, only to be dismissed as alarmists, now found themselves at the center of public vindication. C-SPAN aired the hearings wall to wall as Americans tuned in to see high-ranking officials grilled under oath. Defense contractors, counterintelligence officers, and Pentagon auditors alike were called to testify, their prepared statements often interrupted by pointed questions and growing accusations of systemic failure. Senator Howard Claiborne of Texas opened the first session with a thunderous declaration. This isn't just about a suitcase full of secrets. It's about a government asleep at the wheel while the enemy walk through the front door. Meanwhile, the FBI director, Walter H. Bryce, seized the opportunity to galvanize institutional momentum, using the hearings to argue that the Voronov operation was merely the most visible instance of what he called undeniable Soviet penetration into the bloodstream of our national security. With grave authority and dramatic flair, Bryce laid out a stark picture of espionage in the modern age, not as shadowy exchanges in dark alleys, but as systematic corruption of internal protocols, clearance processes, and interagency communication. In his closing remarks, he demanded sweeping reforms, broader wiretap authority, enhanced surveillance capabilities on both foreign nationals and U.S. citizens with access to sensitive data, and a complete overhaul of security clearance procedures. Civil liberties groups balked, warning that the panic was being weaponized to erode constitutional protections. But the tide of fear was too strong, and the electorate too rattled to resist. Polls showed 72% of Americans supported expanded domestic surveillance to prevent further breaches. Within 6 months, new legislation, dubbed the National Intelligence Integrity Act, passed through Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, granting intelligence agencies unprecedented access to internal records and reducing judicial oversight for counterintelligence operations. Defense contractors were subjected to a new regime of federal compliance reviews. State Department personnel underwent mandatory polygraphs. Internal audit departments ballooned overnight. The CIA quietly rewrote its vetting protocols for overseas assets. And across the country, government employees began self-censoring even casual conversations about work, wary of appearing too curious, too critical, or too connected. More than a policy shift, the Voronov case became a psychological rupture, a before and after moment that reshaped how intelligence was gathered, shared, and safeguarded. From Langley to Los Alamos, the ripples spread. Job offers revoked, clearances suspended, friendships scrutinized. A climate of suspicion settled into the bones of the bureaucracy, calcifying into a doctrine that would define American counterintelligence for the rest of the Cold War. And in the background, far from the televised hearings and soundbite condemnations, a silent understanding took root among the few who knew the full scope of what had been lost. The suitcase had been real, the spy was real, and if it had taken this long to catch one, how many more had already slipped through? In the winter-gray stillness of a divided Berlin, with snow slicking the cobblestones at Checkpoint Charlie and breath fogging in the air of American and Soviet operatives alike, the trade was made in silence. No ceremony, no press, just the mechanical choreography of Cold War pragmatism. Alexei Voronov, the ghost who had haunted American intelligence for over 2 decades, walked calmly across the bridge separating East from West, his overcoat buttoned, his hands unshackled, his expression unreadable. In exchange, the Soviets released Daniel Keene, a 24-year-old American graduate student who had been detained in Moscow on dubious charges of unauthorized technological acquisition while conducting research on Cold War-era political archives. The optics of the trade were palatable enough to pass through American media filters as a diplomatic win, especially with Keene's gaunt figure returning to U.S. soil amid flashes of cameras and the embrace of his tearful mother. But inside the Bureau, and deeper still within the CIA's counterintelligence corps, the trade left a bitter taste, because what Voronov had done hadn't just been daring, it had been precise, surgical, and damningly internal. Despite months of interrogation and exhaustive post-capture debriefings, the essential question remained unanswered. How had he gained access to such a broad array of sensitive military, aerospace, and diplomatic materials without ever leaving a trail that could be traced back to a single leak? Surveillance logs, decrypted correspondence, and even informant interviews failed to reveal one critical node in the network: an individual inside the U.S. government or a contractor agency who had to have acted as a deep source, passing along specific documents too recent or too obscure to have come from archived systems. This person, referred to in internal reports as Shadow Asset Alpha, was never identified. Despite painstaking audits of every name linked to the classified material in the suitcase, no one fit the behavioral, financial, or logistical profile well enough to justify indictment. One theory posited that the leak had come from a staff member in a transient position, someone hired through a temporary clearance waiver, now long gone and beyond reach. Another, more unsettling hypothesis suggested that the leak had never stopped, that the person still remained embedded, lying dormant, undetected within the bureaucracy, either having cut ties with the Soviets following Voronov's arrest or waiting for new instructions from a different handler. Either way, the silence was deafening. Internally, a handful of intelligence officers pushed for continued surveillance and long-term behavioral monitoring of a select list of potential suspects. But as public attention faded and political pressure shifted toward new international crises, resources were reallocated and files were quietly archived. Voronov, for his part, disappeared into the folds of Soviet intelligence history. Rumors surfaced years later that he had died in a dacha outside Moscow. Others claimed he had been promoted within the GRU and then reassigned under a new identity, but nothing was ever confirmed. What endured was the sense of unfinished business, that behind the silence of a man traded for a student, behind the vanished fingerprints and sealed compartments, one final secret had been carried across the bridge that morning and was still out there, unresolved, waiting to surface when the nation least expected it. Locked away in a temperature-controlled chamber, deep beneath the FBI's Quantico Evidence Preservation Facility, behind layers of biometric access points and heavy magnetic vault doors, sits a scuffed brown leather suitcase in a glass case bolted to the floor. Not polished, not restored, just as it was the day it was taken from Alexei Voronov's hand at Union Station in 1963. It's not labeled for public display. There's no placard, no nameplate, no official acknowledgement in any tour or press release. Its file is marked Classified, Perpetual Retention, under Section 7 of the National Espionage Evidence Act, accessible only to a short list of individuals with the highest level of clearance, and even then, only upon direct request with a signed national security waiver. But within the quiet corridors of intelligence history, the suitcase is legendary, a physical artifact not just of the secrets it carried, but of the psychological war it revealed. The ghost of a conflict fought not with armies, but with whispers, disguises, and absolute patience. The case has become required study material in advanced FBI counterintelligence training modules, often used as a chilling example of how even the most secure institutions, fortified by layers of protocol, patriotism, and surveillance, can be compromised by a single individual with the right training, the right opportunity, and the discipline to blend in for years without a single misstep. To some in the Bureau, the suitcase is a sobering reminder that no clearance level, badge, or oath can guard against human cunning. To others, it's almost sacred, a relic of the invisible war that defined a generation of intelligence operatives. What's most unsettling isn't the contents themselves, though the stolen microfilm, the forged documents, and the miniature spy tools remain chilling in their precision. But what the suitcase implied, that America's enemies weren't always foreign agents sneaking past its borders, but sometimes people who had already passed through the security checkpoints, who wore the same uniforms, answered the same phones, attended the same briefings, and knew exactly which doors would open with the right badge. Long after Voronov vanished into Soviet archives, and long after the spy ring he led was neutralized, The deeper mystery of how he accessed such compartmentalized material still casts a shadow across multiple agencies, a silent indictment of overconfidence in closed systems and procedural safeguards. That suitcase taught the intelligence community a lesson that no agent ever forgets. Secrets are only safe until someone decides they no longer belong where they are, and disappearance isn't about vanishing from sight. It's about never having drawn attention in the first place. The suitcase is still there, its handle frayed, its latch worn smooth, the ghost of 100 fingerprints layered over years of silent passage. And inside it lies not just evidence, but a message, unspoken yet undeniable. It's not the spy you see that destroys you, it's the one who waits, unnoticed, until the moment you finally open the bag and realize it was already too late.